Before we begin, a quick warning. This story contains details that may be distressing to some viewers. Please listen with discretion. If you enjoy true crime and mysterious cases, please take a moment to subscribe to Chapman Crime. Your support helps me share more stories, reach new viewers, and keep this channel growing. Don't forget to like, comment, and follow. It truly helps more than you know. Before the headlines called him the Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Trenton Chase was simply a quiet, withdrawn boy growing up in the California suburbs. He was born on May 23, 1950 in Santa Clara County, a time and place where appearances mattered and problems stayed behind closed doors. But even in childhood, something inside him was different, something no one truly understood until it was far too late. Richard's family seemed ordinary from the outside, a working father, a homemaker mother, and a modest middle-class home. Yet beneath that calm surface, tension ruled every room. His father was a strict disciplinarian, prone to rage and emotional coldness. His mother, struggling with depression and paranoia, often retreated into silence. Their marriage was filled with shouting and distance, and Richard absorbed every bit of that chaos. Neighbors described him as shy, quiet, and polite, but uneasy. He rarely smiled, avoided eye contact, and seemed disconnected even when surrounded by other children. At school, he was teased for being spacey, and teachers noticed he struggled to focus. As the years went on, his behavior became stranger, his imagination darker. By the age of 10, Richard was showing clear signs of what psychiatrists later called the McDonald triad, three behavioral patterns often seen in violent offenders. He wet the bed into his teens, set small fires, and began hurting animals. It wasn't simple cruelty, it was fascination. He was drawn to the idea of control, of seeing what happened when life slipped away. His parents' marriage finally collapsed when he was in high school. The divorce pushed his already unstable world further out of balance. He became even more isolated and withdrawn, often skipping classes, wandering alone, or sitting for hours without speaking. He started to show symptoms of hypochondria, convinced something was wrong inside his body. He complained that his heart sometimes stopped beating, that his stomach was missing, that blood was leaking from his veins. Doctors at the time dismissed these claims as stress or drug use. But what was happening to Richard wasn't physical, it was psychological. By his late teens, he was already sliding into a dangerous delusional state. Around this time, he began experimenting with alcohol and drugs, LSD and marijuana mainly, hoping to quiet the voices and sensations he didn't understand. But instead of calming him, the substances deepened his paranoia. He began to believe that someone was poisoning him, controlling him through invisible signals or draining his blood through his skin. Friends who spent time with him recalled how rapidly he changed. His once clean appearance gave way to long hair, pale skin, and sunken eyes. He would ramble about losing his heart or needing blood to keep it beating. He once caught a cat, killed it, and smeared its blood on his face, telling a friend that it kept him alive. His mother confronted him but dismissed it as a phase, the kind of thing no parent ever imagines could grow into something monstrous. In his early 20s, he began living alone. His father still tried to help him, but Richard resented authority. His apartment became a reflection of his mind, filthy, dark, and unsettling. Neighbors often complained about a foul smell coming from inside, but when police investigated, he told them he had spilled raw meat. They accepted the excuse and left. It was a missed warning, one of many. The boy who had once been quiet and withdrawn was now consumed by fear and obsession. He believed his body was failing him and that the only cure was blood. His delusions were no longer whispers in his mind. They had become his truth. And as his reality collapsed, Richard Chase began crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. The making of a monster didn't happen overnight. It was built piece by piece and through neglect, misunderstanding, and untreated illness. Behind that pale, distant stare was a man terrified of his own body and convinced that the only way to live was to take life from others. By the mid-1970s, Richard Chase's world had fallen completely apart. He was only in his early 20s, but his mind was fractured beyond recognition. What had started as strange habits and paranoid thoughts had become full-blown delusion, a nightmare he couldn't escape and no one around him understood. After leaving his parents' home, Richard moved into a small apartment in Sacramento. Alone for the first time, his mental illness took full control. He no longer trusted food, believing his body could not digest it. He told people that his blood was evaporating, that his heart stopped beating at night, and that his stomach was rotting from the inside. He grew thin and pale, his skin sickly gray. His eyes appeared sunken and lifeless, as though he hadn't slept in days. Neighbors saw him wandering aimlessly, sometimes half-dressed, talking to himself or staring into the distance. He complained of being poisoned, of invisible chemicals burning his brain. When he couldn't find answers, he turned inward, and his delusions grew darker. Richard became convinced that his blood was disappearing, and that he needed to replace it to survive. He began killing small animals, rabbits, cats, and birds, not out of cruelty but out of twisted necessity. He would drain their blood into cups or blend their organs with soda, drinking the mixture in a desperate attempt to restore himself. He told one acquaintance that his body was shutting down and that animal blood kept him alive. "I can feel it working," he said once, eyes wide with conviction. The reality was simple and tragic. Richard Chase was gravely ill. He was suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia, but without treatment or family oversight, his delusions spiraled unchecked. His mother still visited occasionally but refused to have him institutionalized again. She believed he just needed independence. In truth, every day he slipped further from reality. In 1975, things took an even darker turn. Richard was found wandering the Nevada desert covered in blood. Police stopped him, suspecting he had been in an accident. Inside his truck, they found a bucket filled with blood and organs from a dead rabbit. When questioned, Richard calmly explained that the blood was his and that someone had stolen it and he was taking it back. He was arrested and placed under psychiatric care. At the hospital, staff described him as distant, emotionless, and eerily polite. He told doctors that his blood was turning to powder, and that if he didn't drink more, he would die. He was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and given antipsychotic medication. For a time, he improved. His delusions faded and he began interacting normally again. The staff felt he had stabilized, but in reality, he had only learned to hide his illness. After 6 months, doctors declared him safe to return to society. He was released into his mother's care. Within weeks, she decided he didn't need his medication anymore. Richard stopped taking his pills, stopped eating, and stopped sleeping. The voices came back louder than ever. He began collecting knives and blending raw organs from animals into a gruesome concoction he called his blood tonic. He filled his refrigerator with them, labeling jars with dates like a scientist tracking an experiment. His apartment reeked of decay. When police responded to complaints, he told them the smell came from spoiled hamburger meat. They left without searching further. Richard's delusions now defined every part of his life. He believed that Nazi experiments had damaged his arteries, that UFOs controlled his blood pressure, and that his heart could only beat when he consumed blood. He wasn't a killer yet, but he was no longer just sick. He was evolving into something else, a man convinced that survival required sacrifice. And before long, his obsession with blood would leave the world of animals and turn toward people. By late 1977, the man who once terrified his neighbors with talk of blood and body decay was now completely ruled by his delusions. Richard Chase had crossed a threshold, no longer a man searching for help, but one consumed by the belief that his body was failing him and that only blood could keep him alive. He spent his days wandering the streets of Sacramento, unkempt and thin, his hair wild, his clothes stained. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was about conspiracies. He believed his blood was turning to dust, that aliens were controlling him, and that his heart had stopped. He thought people around him were imposters, spies sent to steal what little life he had left. At home, the refrigerator had become a small laboratory of horror. Inside were animal organs, jars filled with thick liquid, and blender cups labeled with dates. He drank the mixture daily, convinced it was medicine. He wrote erratic notes and drawings, including one that simply said, "The blood is the life." Neighbors noticed he had started carrying a gun. He would walk down the street, staring into parked cars, muttering about how he was being watched. He'd stand silently at the end of driveways, sometimes trying to open people's doors. In one chilling incident, he approached a woman's house and tried to enter. When she asked what he was doing, he calmly replied, "I need to come inside." When she refused, he left without argument, but it was a glimpse of what was coming. On December 29, 1977, Richard Chase committed his first murder. 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, A retired engineer was helping his wife bring groceries into their Sacramento home when he suddenly collapsed. At first, she thought he had suffered a heart attack. Then she saw the blood. Ambrose had been shot in the chest by a bullet fired from a passing car. It seemed like a random drive-by, until witnesses described a small, disheveled man in a tan car speeding away. Police later found spent shell casings from a .22 caliber rifle. The weapon matched one Chase had recently purchased. In the days that followed, Chase's paranoia exploded. He was convinced the government was tracking him. He covered his windows with aluminum foil to block radio waves. He claimed someone was trying to poison him through the water supply, so he began drinking only animal blood again. He once told a friend that human blood was the purest, and that one day he might need it to survive. The murder of Ambrose Griffin went unsolved for weeks. There was no clear motive, no connection between victim and killer. To the public, it was a random act of violence. But to Richard Chase, it was the beginning of a mission. The act hadn't calmed him. It had confirmed what his mind already believed, that taking life gave him life. Over the next few weeks, he began testing boundaries. He broke into houses, taking small items or simply walking through them and leaving again. Investigators later discovered that he followed a pattern. He only entered homes that were unlocked. He believed that if a door was locked, he wasn't invited. But if it was open, it was fate, a sign that he was meant to enter. Sacramento at the time was quiet, peaceful, and unaware that something dark had awakened within its suburbs. Richard Chase was learning how to hunt, guided by delusion and driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied. The first killing was random, a chance encounter with a stranger. The next ones would not be. By early 1978, Sacramento had no idea that a quiet, pale man was drifting from neighborhood to neighborhood, testing doors and watching windows. Richard Chase had crossed a line no one could see, from delusion into ritual. The man who once believed his blood was turning to dust now believed that the only way to stay alive was to take blood from others. He had developed a strange philosophy. In his mind, a locked door meant a home was protected, off limits, as he would later call it. But an unlocked door was an invitation, a sign that the person inside was meant to be his source of life. He began roaming through neighborhoods looking for open doors, and when he found one, he entered quietly, sometimes just to walk through rooms and leave again. It was as if he was practicing for something larger. That something arrived on January 23, 1978. That day, Richard Chase entered the home of a young woman named Teresa Wallen. She was 22, newly married, and 3 months pregnant. Her husband was away at work and the neighborhood was still. For Chase, the door was unlocked, and that was all the invitation he needed. What happened inside that house became one of the most disturbing chapters in California's history. When police later found the scene, they realized this was not a simple murder. It was ritualistic, it was methodical, and it was born entirely from the depths of Richard Chase's delusion. He believed he needed her blood to live, that she was, in his mind, a vessel of life he could draw from. The public didn't know the details right away. The police only said it appeared savage and without reason. But inside the department, veteran detectives understood that this was unlike anything they had seen. Whoever had done it seemed detached from reality, as though the act was scientific, not emotional. 3 days later, Chase returned to the same neighborhood driving the same rust-colored car. Witnesses later said he looked hollow, distant, as though he was watching the world through a fog. A week after the Wallen murder, he struck again, but this time there were multiple victims: a mother, her child, and a visiting friend. The brutality shocked even the most experienced investigators. Sacramento police now realized that they were dealing with a spree killer, and that the person responsible wasn't killing for revenge or pleasure. He was killing out of belief. Detectives found strange evidence at the scenes: fingerprints, shoe prints, and a small .22 caliber casing, matching the same weapon used in the earlier drive-by. They also discovered that the killer had left no signs of forced entry. Every house he entered had an unlocked door. He had chosen his victims by chance, guided by delusion and opportunity. The newspapers began calling him the Vampire Killer, but the truth was more complex. Richard Chase didn't believe he was human anymore. In his mind, he was a creature cursed with decay, doomed to wither without blood. He thought drinking it could heal his body, cleanse his organs, and fix his broken mind. As police built their profile, They described the suspect as a white male in his late 20s, thin, disheveled, and suffering from severe mental illness. But they had no name, only fear. Parents began locking their doors for the first time in years. People avoided walking alone. Every sound in the night became suspect. Sacramento, once quiet and safe, had fallen under a shadow of paranoia, a reflection of the killer himself. The man who believed locked doors meant safety had now made the entire city believe it too. And as detectives struggled to connect the pieces, Richard Chase was already preparing for his next hunt, one that would finally lead police to his door. By the end of January 1978, Sacramento was frozen in fear. Within a span of just a few weeks, several brutal murders had shattered the city's sense of safety. Police worked day and night, their evidence boards covered in photos, maps, and red string connecting seemingly unrelated crimes. But a pattern was beginning to form, one that led straight to Richard Chase. Detectives noticed that every victim lived within a few miles of each other. Each home showed no sign of forced entry, and each crime scene revealed the same haunting details: the use of a .22 caliber weapon, the erratic violence, and the same strange ritual elements that defied logic. Whoever the killer was, he wasn't trying to hide what he'd done. It was as though he didn't think it was wrong at all. Witnesses began coming forward. One woman told police about a disheveled man who had come to her door days before one of the murders, holding a paper bag and asking if she had old magazines. When she refused, he grew angry and left, but she remembered the look in his eyes. Another reported a man driving a rust-colored 1966 Ford Ranchero who had been seen in the area of the crimes. Police traced that vehicle description to a man who had recently purchased a .22 caliber pistol, Richard Trenton Chase. When officers first approached his apartment building, they found the front door closed but not locked. What they smelled before they even stepped inside made them stop. The air was thick with decay, rot, and something chemical, like spoiled meat mixed with metal. Detectives forced the door open, weapons drawn. What they saw inside confirmed their worst fears. The apartment was in complete chaos. On the walls, streaks of reddish-brown stains. In the kitchen, a blender filled with what looked like congealed liquid. The refrigerator contained several small containers labeled with dates. Inside them were animal organs and what appeared to be blood samples. Dishes were piled high in the sink, and on the table were newspapers marked with strange circles and scribbled notes about poisoned blood and heart control. In one corner of the room, police found a small collection of knives, a .22 caliber pistol, and a box of ammunition. Underneath it, more notes, describing how he believed the government was controlling his bloodstream through radio signals. It was a scene that made even seasoned detectives pause in silence. And then, they found evidence linking him directly to the killings, including items that belonged to the victims, hidden inside drawers and boxes. Realizing they had the right man, police set up surveillance outside the apartment. They knew he was armed, unpredictable, and possibly delusional. When Richard finally returned, he was carrying a blood-stained box and appeared confused to see officers waiting for him. He tried to flee but was quickly tackled and arrested on the spot. At the station, Richard Chase was calm, eerily so. He didn't ask why he was being arrested or what he had done. When questioned, he said he was being framed by Nazis and UFOs. He claimed that people were stealing his blood and replacing it with battery acid. He smiled when detectives mentioned the victims but never denied knowing them. He simply said they were already dead. The case shocked the nation. News headlines called him the Vampire of Sacramento. But investigators saw something different. A man whose untreated mental illness had destroyed everything around him. The evidence from his apartment left no room for doubt. His fingerprints, the weapon, the victim's belongings, all of it told the same story. The spree had been driven not by anger or greed, but by delusion. When Richard Chase was booked into custody, he seemed relieved. He told one detective quietly, "I don't have to drink anymore. They'll feed me now." The manhunt was over. But what investigators found in that apartment would haunt them for years. When Richard Trenton Chase was finally brought into custody in early 1978, Sacramento could breathe again. But relief was quickly replaced by disbelief. No one could comprehend the depth of what detectives had uncovered, or how a man so disturbed had walked unnoticed among them for so long. The trial that followed would not only expose the horrors of his crimes, but also ignite one of the most controversial debates in California's legal history: sanity versus responsibility. Psychiatrists who examined Chase described him as one of the most profoundly psychotic individuals they had ever met. He suffered from paranoid schizophrenia so severe that he lived in an alternate reality, convinced his organs were dying and that blood was the only cure. In interviews, he spoke calmly about his delusions, claiming that people around him were draining his energy and that he was forced to defend himself. Prosecutors, however, saw something else. Not a victim of illness, but a man who had planned his acts, purchased weapons, and covered his tracks. They argued that he understood right from wrong, even if his mind was twisted by paranoia. They wanted the death penalty. The courtroom was tense, filled with reporters and members of the public who wanted answers. Chase sat motionless through most of the proceedings, his expression blank, his body frail and hunched. When witnesses described what they had seen, he rarely reacted. He doodled in notebooks, scribbling strange diagrams and numbers. Psychiatrists testified that Chase's delusions were genuine, that he believed the government was poisoning him, and that drinking blood was the only way to survive. But the prosecution countered that even in madness he had shown awareness. He locked doors, hid evidence, and tried to avoid capture. In May 1979, after 5 months of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on 6 counts of murder, he was sentenced to death and sent to California's gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. But Richard Chase wouldn't live to face execution. In his cell, he remained isolated, feared even by other inmates. Guards described him as quiet but unpredictable, sometimes refusing to eat, claiming his food was poisoned. His fellow prisoners, disturbed by his reputation, often refused to be near him. He told one guard, "They're turning my blood to powder again." On December 26, 1980, 2 years after his arrest, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell. He had overdosed on medication he had been secretly hoarding. At 30 years old, the man known as the Vampire of Sacramento was gone. For many, his death brought closure, but for others, especially the families of his victims, it only deepened the questions. Could his crimes have been prevented if someone had intervened sooner? How many warning signs had been missed? And what does justice mean when the killer himself was trapped inside a mind he could not control? The case of Richard Chase changed how America viewed the intersection of mental illness and violence. It became a chilling example of what happens when psychiatric systems fail, when delusion turns to obsession, and obsession to tragedy. Decades later, his story still lingers in the public imagination, not because of the horror of his acts, but because of how preventable they might have been. Richard Chase didn't wake up one morning as a monster. He became one slowly, piece by piece, through neglect, misunderstanding, and the unchecked collapse of a human mind. And though his name became legend, his legacy remains a warning that sometimes the darkest horrors are not born from evil alone, but from the silence that lets madness grow.